Yasmin. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So, I am super excited to hear your story. Now, I guess let's start with the ADHD diagnosis. How old were you? How long ago were you diagnosed, and what were some of the signs that led you to think that this could be ADHD?
So I was diagnosed about 3 years ago, but if you take it a lot like back, apparently my school counselor told my parents that I could have some sort of neurodivergence, and my parents said, probably not. I didn't get an official diagnosis. Uh, but looking back, I can see that half my family is potentially neurodivergent. And when I was in reading an article in 2019 about basically intersex people, especially in specific like conditions of intersex people being much more like common having ADHD, sorry. Like they had much more high comorbidity, or however you want to phrase that,
Mhm.
with ADHD and intersex, and I was falling into one of those intersex conditions. I was curious and wanted to look up the symptoms of having ADHD, because I do have a psychology bachelor's and master's degrees, but we only talked about like um, autism and ADHD in children, and I was in my mid 20s at that point. So I have never thought of like myself as possibly having ADHD or autism. And then a year later, I mustered the courage up to go talk to a psychiatrist and say, "Hey, I think I may have ADHD. Can you help me out?" And that's when the process started.
Wow. And how was that? How was the diagnosis process? Was that fairly easy?
I think for me the most difficult part was me not being believed at first. Like they were like, "You are able to speak properly. You seem not too hyper. You seem fine. You are like in your mid 20s. You have been through
Higher
school. You had a
education. Yeah.
master's, higher education. Yeah, no way you could have an ADHD or autism." And so I said, "Look, like there's this letter of my like school counselor from back in middle school. Like, maybe you can check that out, because there's a tendency to believe other medical professionals more easily than ourselves." And then they said, "Oh, okay, let me, check with my supervisor." And then I got to meet their like supervisor, who was a professor in psychiatry, and then we had some meetings across, I guess, 3 to 4 months. Throughout, we had some questionnaires, some questions, some tests. Like it was funny. One appointment, they kept the door open just to see if I would get distracted, which I don't know if that's like scientific, and stuff like that. And I would fill out questionnaires, and then I filled out like is it the Minnesota personality questionnaire, like 500 plus questionnaire?
Uh-huh.
They said, "Oh, okay, we believe you. You're probably not lying," because there's also this fear of like people abusing like ADHD medication. And my point of wanting to get a diagnosis wasn't even necessarily like getting medication, but feeling like the sort of relief that I wasn't, I don't know, a bad or incompetent person. I was just different, because I felt shamed and incompetent and, I don't know, late, insufficient, and I just wanted to see if that could be related to ADHD, not to use it as an excuse, but to see if, there were some reasons that I was different and not necessarily insufficient, incompetent. So it took a while, but then in one at the end I had to sit in front of like council of doctors, of like six doctors, and they ended up believing me and gave me an ADHD diagnosis. I also wanted to get like autism testing, but that has even been more difficult. But yeah, now for the past, I guess, 3 years I've had the diagnosis. Yeah.
Hmm. Wow, that's so fascinating. And, it's one of the only studies that is references the comorbidity of gender dysphoria and ADHD is actually a study out of Turkey in 2017, which I've seen that study. It just, I'd never realized it was out of Turkey until I was doing a little background research for this episode, which was, I think, was so fascinating because one of the things we talk about a lot on this podcast is, discerning when you're diagnosed in adulthood, whether or not, the ADHD symptoms are actually ADHD or if they're exacerbated by trauma symptoms of living a life undiagnosed. And I feel like it must have been very fascinating to look over the course of your life through this new lens, also dealing with some of the pathologization of being intersex, and also, like you had mentioned when you had reached out to me, the commonalities of feeling other, right? Like feeling like you are outside of what is normal. And sometimes we like, what is so wonderful about a neurodivergent diagnosis is just like you said, like that feeling of the why, the explanation behind that feeling of difference that so many of us had. So I'm curious, for your perspective, what was it like after the diagnosis, looking back over the course of your life? I know that's a huge question, but what were, especially with a psychology background, like I'm very curious to see, were there any interesting epiphanies in terms of your own life?
The one thing that came to my mind was so in primary school I was called the um, Istanbul dumpster, which is the city I live in. Is so because my desk was so basically unorganized. It's not funny, I guess, being called a dumpster, but I mean, I get it. Like papers were just like flowing out of my desk and stuff like that. And one of my teachers said, "I'm gonna make you like the class captain, and your sole job was going to be at the end of the day making sure that everyone's cubbies are organized enough before they leave." And suddenly I was so good at it. My desk was so tidy, the cubbies, my cubby was the tidiest, everyone's was like, we all got like small like cubby, and everything was tidy now, because at the end of the day, if I did my job, my basically teacher would give a sticker, right? So looking back, I'm like, before having like, I'm being told that I should keep a tidy desk, right? But I still can't, like, or won't do it most days properly. Like, I keep losing papers, my papers keep getting crumbled and stuff like that. Can't keep track of stuff. And once I had like a different type of incentive, I was not only be able to be on top of my like organization and cleanliness, I was also able to like help others and stuff like that. So looking back, it was so like interesting to acknowledge, because like for almost 2 years I my desk was the Istanbul dumpster basically. It was just in the middle of class, papers would just fall out of my desk. So it's weird that how I don't know, my brain worked, I guess, differently, and had to have that like sort of different incentive or different motivation, because it's not like I didn't want to have a tidy desk, right? Because I'm being told almost every day, your desk is a disaster, go have it tidy. And I still couldn't. Yeah, I was thinking of that. I was thinking of being bored in class and coming up with my own questions. Like, I would be done early with some of the questions and just come up with my own, like, alternate questions. And that made everyone think, oh, they're super genius. But no, I was just trying to make sure that I didn't drift off and was able to like continue to focus on the topic and stuff like that. I have funny instances mostly over school. And I guess in friendships I was not the best in waiting my turn when we were playing board games or speaking. I would just cut off people when they were speaking a lot. I would just like, someone would finish their turn and my mind would be like, oh, I guess it must be my turn, and just pick up the dice. But no, there are like two other people that have to come before you, and things like that that seem funny to me now looking back.
Have you talked about the diagnosis with your family or with your parents? Have they come
I
around?
have, well, yes, they do acknowledge and believe me that I do have ADHD. Mostly, I think because a medical professional has told them that I do have ADHD. And I realized when I was talking with them was one of the main reasons they were so like closed off to having going down the road of like seeing if I was neurodivergent, if I had ADHD back when I was younger, was because they believed ADHD to be something negative or like a disease, disorder, and stuff like that. And they didn't, they had already had this difficulty of having a child who was intersex, and they were already afraid of me being accepted by society and fitting in with the norms, and they just didn't want me to be any different than I already was, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Now looking back and talking with them, I understand where their worries were coming from, because it's not like being ADHD is always fully embraced by the rest of the society or even medical professionals or institutions. But now they understand that it is not necessarily a deficit or a disease or a disorder, even if it's like diagnosis, because it they understand that differences can exist without one being better or worse than the other. I think that was what made them come around, basically.
Oh, that's lovely. Well, and I think also, excuse me, I think also a lot of the time with a family situation, they're seeing the positive side of ADHD and they're mostly looking at it as like, well, this is how our family is, right? I don't think they look at it as being a disorder. Why would they? Is it even a disorder, right? I mean, a lot of this stuff is just kind of how we think. And so usually your family members are the ones who don't see anything wrong with who you are because you're very much like they are, and there is nothing
Yeah,
wrong with it,
yeah.
right? So I think we have as parents, there's that understanding that ADHD, like you said, is a negative thing. It's something maybe even I think a lot of parents sometimes feel threatened that this is a reflection of their parenting and that they because a lot of the time it feels like ADHD characteristics are just a result of poor parenting, right? So they kind of blame themselves and yeah. So it is always nice when I hear parents kind of coming around to like, oh yes, okay, fine, neurodivergence, that's a thing, that's just who we are. But it's interesting that they wanted to protect you too. I think that's a very real experience. Just speaking as a parent of two children who have been diagnosed with ADHD, I do want to protect them from the label and the stigma of people assuming that they are one thing because ADHD is so misunderstood. Now, another thing I was fascinated by when I was doing a little bit of background research was that 2% of people around the world are intersex, which is, like 1 in 50. That was really surprising to me. And so you were female assigned at birth. When did you always know that you were intersex?
No, I did not. I found some medical reports in late middle school, I guess when I was 13 or so, that talked about some surgeries I had had and treatment I had had. And I looked up the words. My English was not that good at that time, so I was using Google Translate, which also wasn't that great at that time. Like 15 years ago, Google Translate did exist, but not very well. Um, so I was trying to understand what all that meant, and then I found out that I had something called like mosaic Turner syndrome or whatever, which is one of the conditions under the intersex umbrella. And only like 5 or 6 years later did I actually hear the word intersex, because previously I had only come across medical abbreviation, medical like documentation, and intersex is mostly a term used by like intersex actors or intersex people who wanted to have a word to describe them that isn't necessarily coming from a medical like approach or medicalized approach. I do feel like both intersex and differences in sexual development are great, but at the time we also didn't have differences in sexual development, so I understand why intersex people felt the need to come up with a different wording, because at the time we were called like deficient or like disorders in sexual development, so it wasn't a very positive terminology. And once I found out I was intersex, I kind of went down a rabbit hole of doing research, and in 2013 I found the first intersex blog in Turkish, which is like my main language, my mother tongue. And from then on I became a part of, I guess, the initiative who's started that blog. And it's interesting because so as you said, it's around 2% of people are born intersex that we know of. Could be more because we don't all have our hormone levels or chromosomes checked out. But it's basically the same as the number of, like, the ratio of people with green eyes. So it's not something that isn't uncommon. It's not something that we don't come across. So that was really an interesting journey from, I think now I'm 28, almost 29, and it's still a journey ever since I was 13, understanding what intersex is and what it means to me.
Yeah, I'm sure, right? And I think, gosh, it's so the similarities just in terms of that feeling of other, right? That feeling of difference, I think, is really interesting. And one of the where do I want to go with this? I feel like I have like 18 questions that are all coming at the same time. I'm curious, so the study that I had referenced earlier that explored gender dysphoria, it was a small study, but it was, and I'll reference it in the show notes, but basically there was a 75% of the subjects had ADHD, which is incredible comorbidity. So have you done any research, or why do you think there is such a high comorbidity with ADHD and gender dysphoria? And is there a difference between gender dysphoria and intersex? I mean, obviously there's a difference, but would you consider intersex to be under the umbrella of gender dysphoria?
So intersex is not completely irrelevant, but we describe intersex as being something about your sex characteristics, such as your like secondary sex characteristics, when you're like how much hair you have, etc., or chromosomes, certain hormone levels, and stuff like that. Gender dysphoria or gender identity is more about your understanding of your gender or your feelings toward gender. So one of them is being intersex is more biological usually than having gender dysphoria. But so there are a lot of research, and they do say pretty much the same thing, that intersex people are 5 times more likely to describe themselves as trans or in the trans umbrella or as having gender dysphoria than non-intersex or endosex folks. So I think that's because mainly because of intersex people not already fitting into one of the two like gender categories under the gender binary, right? So if you're already not biologically, physically not fitting into the two categories given to you, I do feel like it makes sense that you're more likely to feel gender dysphoria or be under the trans umbrella. And there's also a 2019 research which I can share with you that also showed high comorbidity with ADHD and intersex in 6 European countries with, I think, if I remember correctly, a few hundred participants. And that was also really interesting to me because, well, we are a small group of intersex activists in Turkey, and a lot of us have been formally diagnosed with ADHD. So I was really curious into seeing like what that's about, right? And then I came across a limited number of studies, but credible studies nonetheless. And oof, the first question you asked, like, why do I think there's this comorbidity? That's such a difficult question to answer for
I
me. I honestly
just
don't know.
I
um,
mean, these are just
I
theories more than anything else. Neither of us
yeah.
is deeply into the research, but I'm curious if you have theories. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the reasons may be because there are differences in our development and neural development included in from in utero, so from a very early age, and that may be one of the reasons. And I think one of the other weird social reasons may be because both having intersex, being intersex, sorry, and having ADHD or being ADHD come with a lot of shame and stigma, and that's also an interesting thing for me to realize because oftentimes the intersex activists around me find that they're intersex because they already have an ADHD diagnosis, or find that they have ADHD because they know that they're intersex. Because they have similar feelings of shame and stigma, and somehow they look at the comorbidities, or they hear other people with having like the comorbidity, and it's interesting for me to see such commonalities in our experiences in terms of like shame, stigma, and discrimination. Not like haha funny, but like interesting.
Yeah, it's one of the things. So I have a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old. Both of them are would consider themselves outside of the binary, and it's a conversation we have a lot, just as a generational difference. Because for me, growing up, my 16-year-old, my daughter always says that she was like, "Mom, if you were born today, you would be non-binary," because I really like reject a lot of gender norms, and always have always had to kind of, for me, I came from this like feminist generation of having to expand my definition of what is feminine because I didn't agree with a lot of the gender stereotypes that were placed on women, but it didn't occur to me that there might be a way to live outside of the binary back then. We didn't have that language. So I spent a lot of time just developing and expanding what is feminine, if that makes sense. And so it's a conversation I have a lot with her, which is like, is why reject gender, or why live outside of the binary of gender when you can kind of expand it for yourself? And so there's a conversation we have a lot of the time. But one of the things I find interesting is that a lot of neurodivergents really reject anything that is expected of us, right? If there's not a real, like, logical reason. And so a lot of things that fall under tradition are things that we rail against, we fight against, right? Because it's like, this needs to fundamentally, authentically make sense to me. And so when you take the vast majority of gender stereotypes, they don't make sense. They're ridiculous if you, and often go against reason for so many of us. And so that was always my theory about the overlap between neurodivergence, autism, ADHD, and gender dysphoria, is the fact that it's like so many of these social mores are put on us as children that are ridiculous, and we're just trying to like find our authentic way. And so I was curious if that resonates with you, if that's a conversation you have at your age in activism, because these are the moments where I feel like such an old person. And I'm very grateful for my teenagers who are, keeping me informed and TikTok too.
That actually, yes, that definitely resonates with me 100%. It makes a lot of sense because I feel like one of the great things about being neurodivergent is that you are always, or a lot of the times, thinking outside the box, and also you are open to question things. Like, even when you're told like 2 plus 2 is 4, you are eager to ask Why? Why though?
Yeah.
Why is it not 5? Why is it not 0? So I think that makes a lot of sense. We often, in my personal experience as like a person with ADHD and like interacting with other people who are neurodivergent, I see that we often don't like being contained in boxes, and we also often don't like binaries, dichotomies, like black and white, for a lot of things. So I think what you said makes a lot of sense for me and for my age group, at least in Turkey, as well. It's definitely a great, I think, like property of having ADHD. It makes life fun for me.
Right? Well, and I think it also kind of falls into the same category with many of us having difficulty with humor or social niceties, right? Like taking things literally a lot of the time that ends up getting me, for one, in trouble a lot of the time when it comes to social interactions. And a lot of that rigid thinking, too, I think also comes from, like you said, like the why, right? Like this, I need this to make sense to me. I need to really understand. I can't just accept something because you told me to. And now I'm going to be oppositional as a result. Like it all kind of falls back into that category of like this overwhelming drive for authenticity, which I guess also explains why I think so many of us turn to activism and social justice, right?
Yeah, very much so.
So tell me more about the Intersolidarity Turkey uh, initiative, right? Organization initiative. You co-founded that, and what sort of activism work does that? I don't know why I'm having such a hard time finding words. What what is the Intersolidarity Turkey, and what do you guys do?
So Intersolidarity Turkey right now focuses mostly on personal empowerment of intersex individuals living in Turkey and around Turkey, and it also focuses on professional development of legal, medical, and psychosocial workers in terms of having the relevant information and language to help support intersex people. It did originally come about in 2009, but as I said, it started as a blog and then we turned into an initiative years later. There were quite a few iterations of the same initiative in different names because most of us have ADHD and we want to try new names sometimes. And right now we have less of a focus on like political institutional change because it is getting more difficult in Turkey, but we have a larger focus on providing like peer support, legal support, and psychosocial support to individuals who are intersex who live in Turkey or around Turkey, because some of our neighboring countries also don't have any intersex organizations or initiatives. And we also focus on collaborating with and doing trainings with medical professionals, legal, judicial professionals, and psychosocial workers in giving them the support they need so that they can fully support intersex people when they're working with them or when they're providing care to them. Um, yeah, that's about it.
That's amazing. That's wonderful. So, do you feel like how does your ADHD contribute to, I guess, some of the activism work you're doing? What do you love
Well, I
about your
think one of
ADHD?
one of the things that it contributes is like I think my ADHD is playing a big part in me deciding to go full time into activism, right? And seeking like this uh, justice for all mentality. And it also helps you think creatively or differently. So, for example, we in Turkey, um, like intersex rights or the situation of intersex people or LGBTI people in Turkey in general is not the same as back in say 2013 when we were like doing different types of activism. So in some ways we have difficulties, but in other ways there's new sorts of arenas that we could explore, right? There are new types of activism that are emerging that we could do, that we could try. So I think my ADHD helps in thinking of the changes not as a negative, but as new opportunities to explore new ideas and new like types of activism that may work now that maybe didn't work before or couldn't work before or we didn't have the resources to try before. So I think it's interesting to have a differently thinking brain, I guess, because it helps you navigate the changing like political atmosphere, and it also helps you try to be a bit. This may be weird to say, but try to be a bit more selfless and like give you all your energy to helping other like people who are maybe intersex, LGBTI, having ADHD, or who are families and parents of people who are intersex.
Hmm. No, I think that makes sense, right? I mean, I think I feel like many of us have a very heightened sense of empathy, and in terms of wanting to save other people from a struggle that we ourselves experienced, right? And so I think it sort of leads to a heightened sense of empathy in many of us, which is always tragic that so many of us are mistaken as being self-centered, right? And being, selfish and immature, because I think the vast majority of us try so hard to help others, and it kind of leads to that trauma of feeling so misunderstood and so rejected in most of it, in our lives. um, well, that's incredible. So, what else do I want to ask? You had also mentioned about the sense of invisibility. That is I guess, is that can you tell me more about that? Is that in reference to the invisibility of the diagnoses and the communities? Or what did you mean when you had talked about invisibility? Do you remember? It was a
So
while ago.
I so the first thing that I think I meant was basically both being intersex and ADHD. Well, so we are taught in school or by our societies most of the time that there are like two biological or physical like genders or sex or whatever. But in my case, I wasn't fitting neatly into either of those like boxes, right? Not in terms of like just like how I identified myself, but also me physically and biologically, I didn't fit in this like gender binary that was like socially constructed. So that made me feel invisible, for sure. And the commonality here, I think, is that because I was female assigned, I had a much more difficult time getting like accepted or seen as ADHD because I do think that there's still an issue of female ADHD being less accepted and less seen, even though like in the past years I think there's been great efforts to challenge that have been very like emotional for me and making me really happy. But I think we still have some ways to go in terms of showing that ADHD doesn't necessarily need to present in one single way, or that it's not only the boys who have ADHD.
Hmm. Yeah. Oh, that is really, yeah. Gosh, has your ADHD diagnosis helped you in terms of feeling like it less invisible, I guess?
Yes, I think it definitely has because it was only after my diagnosis that I felt comfortable enough to be a part of like neurodivergent or ADHD communities and support groups and online groups and communities. So I think it really gave me a sense of like belonging. And also I think for me being feeling invisible is connected to feeling alone. So when like felt a sense of community and belonging, I also didn't feel lonely or alone, so I didn't feel invisible anymore because I felt that I was being seen by other people who had common experiences to me.
Yeah, it is. It is. I think an experience for many of us is how for many of us who really struggled with friendships and relationships and feeling connected to people, to suddenly find this community of neurodivergent people who you feel so deeply connected to. And there's such, I mean, one of the things I love about the neurodivergent online community is just the overwhelming sense of acceptance and embracing, feeling like you've been embraced in a way that is life changing for so many of us. So, yeah, well said. Now, I'm curious with your psychology background too. How do you sort through what is ADHD and what might particularly be a trauma symptom from childhood? Because that's something that's talked about a lot in terms of the diagnosis process, and also like, maybe this isn't ADHD, maybe you're being misdiagnosed with something else, and often trauma is one of the ones that comes up, right? There's such overlap with trauma symptoms. How do you sort that out in your own brain in terms of you know feeling like you've had to sort of live outside of the norm? And I don't even know what I'm asking. Is there
No, I
are you able to sort through those? Because I find it really difficult to sort through them.
So this may not be the most helpful answer, but to some degree, I feel like we are like whole, complete individuals, and we can't really go pick apart these things, right? We can. I don't know if I can look at anyone, including myself, and say this is trauma for sure, this is ADHD and stuff like that. So for me, I think the best option for everyone is having access to resources to be able to get the diagnosis that would help them the most and that would be most authentic to them. So I don't know if I can ever go, oh no, this is 100% the accurate diagnosis, this is 100% not the diagnosis, or this is a symptom of this and this is a symptom of something different. I don't think I can like do that because like all my experiences and my being is like tied up with each other. So I think as long as the diagnosis is with the current available information and resources the best option, who cares? Kind of. I don't know if it's rude to say that, but like if it works, why not, right? I'm not going to go to a person and say, no, I ban you from saying you have ADHD. I take your ADHD card away from you. You do not have ADHD or anything like that.
No, that's actually a really helpful answer, because I think, it speaks to the complications around pathologizing neurodivergence, and the fact that this is even a diagnosis and a disorder and all of the frustrating labels that are applied to this, when really we are, acknowledging neurological characteristics and traits. And so, do you think that the ADHD diagnosis will still even exist in 50 years?
Ooh, I don't know. I mean, 50 years is a lot in some sense, but I also feel like whether a diagnosis exists or not is has a lot to do with how the health industry works right now. So, like, or
Which,
health insurance works right now.
true, that's
So,
true. Very good point. Yeah.
difficult to answer. Yeah. And I also feel like it's not maybe the worst thing in the world because I do feel like everyone is like not there is no two people who have the same neurology, right? But it's not the worst thing maybe to acknowledge that some people have been facing more difficulty than others, maybe mostly due to how the world is set up, but either way still it's not the worst thing in the world to me to acknowledge that some people may need additional like accommodations or yeah.
Right, absolutely, and that's where I think the disorder part can be very helpful, right, in terms of advocacy and accommodations too. Yeah, it's so fascinating, and I think one of the things I always am questioning constantly through this podcast, which is a lot of the issues around gender and socialization and how ADHD presents so often very differently based on your gender, and where is that coming from? Is that biological or is that socialized, or all of the above? And I don't know why it's so important for me to get to figure it all out. My daughter is always very much like, who cares? Why does it matter? And I'm like, I don't know, it just does. So yeah, I'm always grateful for anybody who's willing to engage in the conversation with me, and that's one thing I'm very grateful for with neurodivergence is we're always willing to engage in the conversation. Be like, that's interesting. So thank you for that. Now, do you have a name for ADHD? Would you call it something else if you could?
It's not like my creation, it's not the most original, but I do often call it being neurospicy. I don't know, it
Uh-huh.
just sounds great to me.
It is a great word.
It's less boring and it's less, I guess, pathologizing and it's more fun and accurate. Like, we are a bit spicy, I feel like. When looking at the rest of, no shade, all the love to neurotypical people, but like, we do tend to come out as more spicy and different.
Right, and I think that falls in line with what we were talking about of being outside of the norm, and also questioning traditions, and questioning anything that doesn't have a real authentic meaning. Is that we're going to get a little spicy. We're going to get a little. I like to say I get a little salty whenever somebody expects me to do something just because they said so. And I definitely was when I was a kid. That's one of those things that I looked back at and I was like, oh yeah. Anytime somebody told me to do something just because, that was when I would immediately start to rebel. So yeah, I think that's definitely, the spiciness is for sure there. Uh, I love that. So now, do you have a website for Intersolidarity Turkey? Is it, where can people find you if they want to learn more about you or the work you're doing?
Yes, we do have a website and it does have English web pages in it, but the URL is in Turkish, so it is interdayanışma.org, but maybe people can find it through show notes. It is interdayanışma.org.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I'll definitely have all of those links in the show notes. So thank you so much. Yeah, well, this has been really lovely, Yasmin. Is there anything else? I feel like I asked you all the questions I wanted to ask, but I also feel like I don't want to let you go because you're so interesting.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a really interesting conversation, and I just encourage everyone to, who feels outside of the norm, to, I guess, continue to find community. That may be just my last comment. And I really wanted to thank you and the podcast for allowing that sense of exploration and that saltiness, and also that sense of community.
Yeah, right now I'm starting to think maybe the word ADHD could just be replaced by salty, the spice rack of neurodivergencies. Uh, that's a lovely thought, and really, yes, I wholeheartedly endorse that. So, yeah, so, well, thank you, Yasmin, for talking to me. It's been really lovely.
Thank you.